Very welcome to the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study and to Linnéanum in the Botanical Gardens of Uppsala. I have the pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor schroeder-Heister, who is a fellow here at SCAS for the semester. PeterSchroeder became Professor of Logic and Philosophy of Language at University of Tübingen in 1989. And he has studied broadly also philosophy, mathematics, musicology, and theology at the Universities of Bonn, Cologne and Aachen. Although he had several offers to take up positions both in Germany and abroad, he has spent most of his career in Tübingen and thus declining other offers. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Belgrade in 2015. PeterSchroeder is a fellow who has been around, so to speak. He has had visiting fellowships at universities in Sweden, in Serbia, in the UK, in China, as well as in France. And schroeder-Heister's main research topic is what he has called proof-theoretic semantics, which is based on the idea that the key notions of philosophical semantics should be those of argument and proof, rather than of denotation and truth. He has published an impressive number of scientific papers on this subject, both from a philosophical and from a computational perspective. And together with his Tübingen group, he has organized a number of very influential conferences in the field, and he has edited many collections on the topic. And further academic interests that have led to published work concern logic in computer science, the history of modern logic, and of cognitive science, including issues of cognitive psychology. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Professor PeterSchroeder to give today's seminar. Very welcome.
Thank you very much, Christina, for this very nice introduction. The Swedish Collegium is a great institution. I'm both honored and pleased to be here in Uppsala of the Linnéanum, which accommodates the Collegium and where I have a beautiful office. So the topic of my talk is paradoxes, local consequence, and the role and future of deductive logic. I start with a little bit about the University of Uppsala and the University of Tübingen. So in 1477, there were these two universities created under Pope Sixtus IV. That's the one to whom we owe the Sixtine Chapel. There was a papal bull permitting to establish a university from February 1477 in Uppsala. The corresponding papal bull for the University of Tübingen dates from the 13th of November 1476. So you see from this both dates that the University of Tübingen is much older than the University of Uppsala, more than 3 months actually. They started teaching both in October 1477, so with the winter term. This is the oldest building of the University of Uppsala, which doesn't exist any longer. It was the Academia Carolina. The new one is the Carolina Rediviva, the now University Library in Uppsala. In Tübingen, we still have a very old building from that time. That is the old Bursa, the Alte Bursa. That's where today the philosophy department is in. What is interesting is that this building has 2 staircases and 2 entrances. So the rest, the right staircase and entrance, that was the Via Antiqua, that was for the realists, and the left staircase was the Via Moderna, that was for the nominalists. So at that time there was this big dispute about the nature of universals, and this is reflected by this fact. And at that time there was a wall that went through the whole building, so it was not possible to walk inside from the one door to the other one. This wall, of course, doesn't exist anymore nowadays. And my area is logic. Logic has a very long tradition as one of the basic topics in philosophy. In medieval times, within the trivium, as a basic topic in every decent education. though not always a well-liked one, actually. And it has become an interdisciplinary subject, but again, not without institutional problems, which is not so surprising. It's both, it's in mathematics, it's in linguistics, it's in philosophy, it's in computer science, and you can well imagine that there's sometimes certain disagreements about things that need to be studied in logic. I give you a few quotations from a very nice book. This is by Vincent Hendricks, that's called Logical Lyrics, which collects quite a number of quotations about the nature of logic. The first quotation is from Simone de Beauvoir: "In masculine hands, logic is often a form of violence, a sly kind of tyranny." So far, Simone de Beauvoir. Charlotte Brontë, in her first novel, The Professor: "Better to be without logic than without feeling." Winston Churchill, in the House of Commons in End 42, "Logic is a poor guide compared with custom." And then Alfred Hitchcock, in a Helsinki newspaper, simply, "Logic is boring." So as logicians, one need not care about these things, but I mean, there were real inferences who wrote about logic in a quite disrespectful way. One of those was Descartes. So Descartes wrote in his Reguli, "It is obvious that this dialectic at that time was still another name for logic, so that this dialectic can only sometimes help to explain more easily to others arguments already known, and therefore that it has to be transferred from philosophy to rhetoric." So the consequence of this would be that logic is accommodated in the wrong department, and essentially it should go from philosophy to rhetorics. In Tübingen, actually, we do have a rhetorics department. The big three philosophers in history are, according to common opinion, also my opinion, Aristotle, Leibniz, and Frege. Aristotle is the one who, by Leibniz, was characterized as writing mathematically outside mathematics. So he was the first who used mathematical symbols to denote logical terms and developed the theory of syllogism, both modal and non-modal. So he laid the foundation for the whole development of logic. Then we have Leibniz in the 17th century. He developed the idea of a logical calculus, and he developed the idea of deduction as computation. That means the relationship between reasoning and calculating. And the third one is Frege. He is the one to whom the whole development of mathematical logic in the 20th century goes back. He explicated in all detail the idea of formal proofs. He also provided basic semantical foundations for natural language. So he's one of the big figures in natural language semantics. Thanks to Frege, logic is now a joint topic of philosophy, linguistics, mathematics, and computer science. It's in all these disciplines. But unfortunately, Frege's appreciation took some time. He not even had a full professorship at the time. But nevertheless, nowadays he is a real classic, and you have various items named after him. For example, streets. This is a residential quarter in Amsterdam, not far from the VU, from the Free University, and there you find Fregelaan. And interestingly, you also find the Carnapstraat and the Wittgensteinlaan. Carnap and Wittgenstein were the two most important students of Frege who had made enormous contributions on the development of philosophy of science and the philosophy of language in the 20th century. There are also real fans of Frege. For example, my colleague Kai Wehmeyer in Irvine, in California. So he has, or at least he used to have, I don't know if he still is using this, a car registration plate, a personalized car registration plate called Frege. So this was a real fan. And an even bigger fan is somebody in Oxford who even named a ship after Frege. This is a photograph my brother brought me from Oxford. This is a houseboat lying in the canal in Oxford, and it is called Begriffsschiff. The main writing of Frege, which was the initial step of modern mathematical logic, was called Begriffsschrift, concept script. And he baptized his ship Begriffsschiff. And if you look more closely here, and if you are aware of the Fregean two-dimensional logical notation, you see that he even embedded this scripture here into a fragment of this notation. So this is something for the real experts. And this definitely was a real fan of Frege. Logic is a big topic, even beyond logic. So there are all sorts of applications of logic in other fields, in linguistics, mathematics, and computer science, for example. But there is also significant usage of logic in regimented argumentation, for example, in law and legal reasoning in general. I will here not talk about these applications, but in what follows, I will talk about certain basic fundamental philosophical questions in the philosophy of logic, those that have interested me most recently, and in particular while staying at the Swedish Collegium. In this sense, because it's a philosophical consideration of what is already there. So I'm not inviting fancy new theorems applying logic. My topic therefore belongs to the realm of the Owl of Minerva, which, as Hegel wrote some more or less exactly 200 years ago, which takes its flight only when the shades of night are gathering. So this is the sort of philosophical methods. We don't change anything. We just discuss and explain what is happening, what is happening when we are doing logic. Hegel also describes it as a painting of gray in gray, and this perhaps even fits to the mood of the current crisis. So the laws of logic, if you look at logical laws, it turns out that there are plenty of them. So if you go through history, you find the law of identity, A equals A, or if A, then A. You find the law of non-contradiction. It's not the case that both A and not A. You have the law of excluded middle, either A or not A. You have the law of reductio ad absurdum. If from A follows falsity, then not A. You have the ex falso quodlibet, that from falsity anything follows. You have the law of double negation, that not A implies A itself. So A is equivalent to its own double negation, and so on and so forth. So there are plenty of these logical laws. And in the logical tradition, since Aristotle, these principles have all been defended as well as challenged. So you find all sorts of opinions about these logical laws. We will be concerned in particular with the ex falso quodlibet in connection with the paradoxes of logic. Now I come to my main topic, which is local consequence and at the same time logical consequence. So I'm talking about logical consequence in relation to the aspects of locality and globality. Logical consequence is one of the basic concepts of logic, one of the central concepts of logic. And the thesis is that in the philosophical theory of logical consequence, local and global principles interact. And the topic of logical paradoxes is a particular case where this interaction comes into play. Before I go into more details, I must first make some acknowledgements, simply because many issues here arose from discussions with others, and I cannot at every place mention from whom it comes. I often simply don't know anymore who brought up this question in the first place. So my main acknowledgement goes to Dag Pravets. Dag Pravets is a philosophy professor at the University of Stockholm. He was a SCAS Fellow in 1991, and this year he has been awarded the Rolf Schock Prize for Logic. The Rolf Schock Prize for Logic is the highest prize, kind of Nobel Prize for Logic, the highest prize in logic that you can receive. It's awarded by the Royal Academy by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and will be awarded hopefully in a ceremony in October. He was one of my doctoral advisors in '81. And the other one to whom I owe a lot, in particular with respect to the paradoxes, is Lars Hallnäs. He has taught at various universities in Sweden, and he has particularly emphasized the interaction between local and global aspects of logical consequence. So many things I'm going to say may actually be due to those authors. So let's have a look at logical consequence. Take as an example from mathematics the theorem of Euclid that there is no largest prime number. Euclid showed that the theorem that there is no largest prime number, so you have, for example, the prime number 29, and this is not the largest one because there's still the prime number 31 and 37 and whatever or so, and there's no largest of them. Euclid showed that this theorem follows from the axioms of arithmetic. So you have the axiom of arithmetic, and what follows from them is the theorem, the mathematical theorem, that there is no largest prime number. What we have here, the important thing here is that the mathematics is actually in the axioms and not in the inferences. So in the inferences, there is just logic. There is nothing domain specific. There's just universal logic. And this is one of the big insights of Aristotle. There is a universal inference machinery called logic, into which content is fed via axioms, and from which you get out certain theorems. Take as an example from science, there's a Popperian example. Take a prediction. You have certain laws of material science. You have certain initial and side conditions. And as a prediction, you have that a wire from which a weight is hanging, that a wire will break within 10 seconds. Again, the relationship between the content, the laws of material science, and this initial and side conditions, and the prediction, this forecast, is actually just and only constituted by logic. So again, there is this universal logic in between. Again, it is so that the science is in the axioms, not in the inferences, and that logic is a basic ingredient in scientific explanation was emphasized by John Stuart Mill and then heavily exploited by Karl Popper later on. Now, the relation of logical consequence itself is metaphysical and thus tenseless. The fact that there is no largest prime number is a logical consequence of the axioms of arithmetic. This fact holds independently of us recognizing it. It's simply true. But of course, there must be deductive arguments that somehow convince us of this metaphysical fact. Otherwise, this metaphysical fact would not in any way be accessible to us. And these deductive arguments, they have a certain sort of epistemic power, where epistemic power means that the premises of an inference somehow force you to accept the conclusion. This is nicely described by Lewis Carroll in his short piece on what the tortoise said to Achilles. The tortoise says, suppose I still refuse to accept Z. So Z is the conclusion of an inference. Suppose I still refuse to accept Z. And Achilles then answers, then logic would take you by the throat and force you to do it. So there is something like this. There is some sort of epistemic power, whatever, however this may be explicated, but it's simply there. This is what deductive arguments are all about. A deductive argument is not just a list of assumptions and a certain conclusion that you can draw from it. So a list of the axioms of arithmetic followed by the claim, therefore there is no largest prime number. This is of course not a proper argument. If we look at this sketch here, you have of course the axioms of arithmetic as the input, and you have there is no largest prime number as at the output, but there are all sorts of steps in between. And they, of course, must be spelled out. And in spelling out these steps, the dots here in the sketch, that was the big achievement of Euclid in this collection. So the decomposition of a consequence claim into single steps is absolutely crucial. So the small steps of which an inference, of which an argument is composed, are called inferences. And performing these small or local inference steps in a certain order yields a global argument, which then establishes a consequence claim. The formal representation of such a global argument, that is an argument written up, is also called a proof. We have then proof theory as a discipline of its own, and this would discuss what follows logically from what are the global properties of proofs, how can proofs be decomposed into inference steps, what are the local properties of proofs, and so on and so forth. And my philosophical thesis here is that these two levels, the local and the global, interact. There is not only a global proof composed out of local steps, but also we have the situation that global properties of proofs contribute to which local steps are considered appropriate. I would just like to mention an analogy from computation. So you have here a multiplication statement which is actually true, but of course you don't see immediately that this is a true statement. So you would have to perform a certain calculation in order to get insight in the truth of this multiplication statement. We need a computation to convince ourselves of this truth, or perhaps a computer, the programming of which we trust. Similarly, for a non-trivial logical statement, we need a proof to convince ourselves of the truth of a non-trivial logical statement. Yeah. So we have a complete analogy between the two cases, and this is actually something this has been strongly established and exploited also in modern computer science. The connection between computation and deduction. It has also been claimed by Leibniz, and it's actually present in the dual sense of Greek and Latin words for calculating. So if you have ratiocinare and logitestai, they both mean calculate and reason. If you want to look at the validity of inferences, it's quite it's interesting to have a look at what interesting and very instructive to have a look at what Aristotle says here, the founder of all this. Aristotle developed a theory of syllogistics. This is a theory of valid inferences, not of all possible valid inferences, but of valid inferences of a certain form, but nevertheless. Celarent is, according to the medieval classification, one of the syllogisms that Aristotle discussed, actually one of the so-called perfect syllogisms. An example is, no heavenly creature is mortal. All angels are heavenly creatures, no angel is mortal. So this would be an example of a valid inference according to Aristotle, called syllogism. But Aristotle not only gives examples of such inferences, but gives a general definition of the validity of an inference in his definition of a syllogism. So he says, quite abstractly, a syllogism is a discourse in which certain things being stated, that is the premises, something other than what is stated follows of necessity from their being so. So the conclusion follows from the premises by necessity. I mean by the last phrase that they produce the consequence, and by this, that no further term is required from without in order to make the consequence necessary. The important thing in the present connection is that the consequence follows without external knowledge. No further term is required from without. That is, with only the knowledge of the premises. When performing such an inference, I reflect on what's meant in the premises, and this leads me then to the conclusion. The modern interpretation would be that this purely internal information is the semantic meaning of the logical constants involved, in this case, the meaning of all and no. So if you look at this inference, you have logical constants, no, all, no and all the rest is exchangeable or so, and it must be somehow the meaning of these logical expressions that generate the validity of this inference. This is actually a local criterion. The semantical consideration of the premises of a local inference step entails its conclusion. That's what Aristotle is saying. And based on a closer look at Aristotle's formulation, this can be understood as generating the necessity of the conclusion. And this again supports an operational interpretation. There are certain justifying operations involved that lead one from arguments for the premises to an argument for the conclusion. An argument for the conclusion can be extracted from arguments for the premises, to use a formulation of Dirk Pravitz's. I spelled this out in an extended set of slides that I put on the web, and that you can only ask me for, where this idea, which, as I said, goes back to Pravitz and to some extent also to the German logician Lorenzen, is spelled out for the case of modus ponens, for the special inference rule of modus ponens. However, I think there is also a global criterion, not only this local one, but also a global criterion. It must be possible to separate the semantical information internal to the premise from other information. If just this semantical information should be what leads us from the premises to the conclusion. I call this the principle of semantical purity. So this principle says that if no external information is present, so no axioms, no assumptions, nothing, it must be possible to establish the premises of an inference solely by the semantical means characteristic of the premises. Because only in that case we can extract or generate the conclusion from the premises. Again, I must refer you here to this extended set of slides that I will make available. This now is a global criterion on which the justification of the local inference depends. It's, so to speak, an adequacy condition for the local criterion. So the picture is that we have a local criterion of the validity of a syllogism, which is also governed by a global adequacy condition. In normal circumstances, this global condition is satisfied, but there are also non-normal circumstances, and particularly sort of these non-normal circumstances are the paradoxes. Paradoxes have driven logical and philosophical discussions since antiquity. I here discuss the liar paradox. That's the paradox of Epimenides of Crete saying all Cretans are liars. This is also called a semantical paradox. Crucial for the development of mathematical logic in the 20th century was also the so-called Russell paradox, which is a mathematical paradox which I could have chosen as well. So the liar in a modern form could be reproduced like this. I have a sentence displayed in red color, and I say the sentence displayed in red is false. This is a sentence that says of itself that it is false. It is a sentence that says I am false. And using this sentence, we can derive a contradiction. We start with a sentence. We assume that the sentence is true. So we suppose the sentence displayed in red is true. And then we have an IDES step. This is not an inference, but just a replacement of something, namely the expression, the sentence displayed in red, which is this whole thing here. We put in here, the sentence displayed in red is false, and this is true. And now comes a conclusion. Therefore, the sentence displayed in red is false, because if a sentence in quotation marks is true, then the sentence itself holds. Conversely, assuming that the sentence displayed in red is false, we replace again the sentence displayed in red, this expression, by the sentence displayed in red, namely by, in quotation marks, the sentence displayed in red is false. This sentence is supposed to be false, but if a sentence that is said, that says is false, then it is of course true. So we have a contradiction in the sense that from the truth of the sentence we get its falsity, and from the falsity of the sentence we get its truth. One might say that perhaps negative self-reference is involved in it. The sentence displayed in red is not true, so false, that means not true, of course, is negatively referring to itself. It is a negative form, it says not true, and it refers to itself by the expression displayed in red. So it says, I am not true. But, now, a negation itself is not a problem. This is something that you find everywhere in logic, and self-reference in itself is no problem either. So if you have a sentence like, the sentence displayed in pink is true, this is fine. I mean, this is definitely not paradoxical. Or when I say I'm always telling the truth, this might be arrogant, but it's definitely not logically paradoxical. But perhaps it's just a combination of the two things, negativity plus self-reference, the combination, negative self-reference. But even that is abundant in everyday language. So when I say I am not giving a long speech, I'm referring to my own speech, and I'm referring to it negatively. So what? Or more, it's artificial sentence. This blue sentence does not consist of more than 8 words. This is simply a false sentence because it does consist of more than 8 words, but this negative self-reflexivity doesn't present any problem. The common diagnosis is that the culprit here is actually the semantical predicate, true and false here, but I actually would like to draw your attention to the logical issues that have to do with the derivation of a contradiction from these sort of paradoxes. So let's have a look at the logical problem. Let S be the sentence displayed in red, the sentence that we had before. Then what we have obtained is, if this sentence is true, then it is false. And if it is false, then it is true. That is, we have obtained S if and only if not S, contradiction. And because this is a contradiction, this is simply false. So this can be seen as just falsity. So what? Can't we just accept something false? At least in a certain situation, in some remote section of our reasoning. I mean, this reasoning about paradoxes is just is a particular way of reasoning. You construct sentences in a very artificial way. So what you're constructing is not at not in the center of our general scientific or political or whatever discourse. So can't we just consider this sort of contradictions as a local phenomenon, as a sort of Spitzfindigkeit, as we say in German? Something that can be confined to a particular sort of philosophical discourse. The problem is here that there is a logical rule, a logical inference involved, namely the ex falso quodlibet. And this law says that falsities or contradictions are explosive. That means if you have falsity, you can derive anything. And if you can derive anything, your system explodes, because you cannot make you cannot draw any distinctions anymore. And if you want to treat the paradoxes just as a local thing, happening in a certain philosophical discourse, we must give up this principle. But this again makes a problem because the X-Falso quadlibet is quite entrenched in the logical basis of our reasoning, both scientific and everyday. So X-Falso quadlibet appears quite more frequently than one normally thinks. And the standard example in logic is disjunctive syllogism. Disjunctive syllogism is this sort of inference, for example, where you conclude from Peter is either German or Swedish, Peter is not Swedish, therefore Peter is German. Very elementary inference of propositional logic. But the justification of this inference normally runs via the X-Falso quadlibet. This inference normally is justified as followed. We have one assumption, Peter is either German or Swedish, so we consider both possibilities. If he is German, then nothing is shown, because if he is German, then Peter is German, and we have already established what you find in the conclusion. But if he is Swedish, then by assumption, we also know that he is not Swedish. And this means that we have a contradiction and therefore a false sentence. And as we can infer anything, by X-Falso quadlibet, we can infer that Peter is German. And that means in either case, Peter is German. Which means that we can justify the inference of disjunctive syllogism just only by saying, by accepting the X-Falso quadlibet as a basic principle. So is there a way then, this would then be the next question, is there a way then to localize somehow the X-Falso quadlibet, to just say that it perhaps only holds for a certain area where you have the strange paradoxes, that in general it holds, but that perhaps in these strange areas of the paradoxes it does not hold. So can we limit it to a certain realm? Disjunctive syllogism shows that it is not easy to give up this rule. We want to keep it in most areas of reasoning. So how can we delineate different areas in a logically convincing way by saying here we have X-Falso quadlibet and in this other area we don't have the X-Falso quadlibet? Now for that we just look at how the X-Falso quadlibet is justified in the first place. How do we come to X-Falso quadlibet? Falsity has these distinctive characteristics that it has no semantical rule. That is, no rule that tells us how falsity can be established, simply because falsity cannot be established. So in a sense, we have that the semantics of falsity is the absence of any explicit semantics. What does that mean? Conversely, this means that from asserting falsity, we can move to anything by X-Falso quadlibet, simply because there is no risk in claiming this rule, as it can never be applied without making further assumptions. It can only be applied using external knowledge. So locally, without external knowledge, X-Falso quadlibet is valid and absolutely unproblematic, but not in all circumstances. Not in the circumstances of the paradoxes. And there we have what I call the retroaction of the global on the local. Let's recall our global adequacy condition that we formulated in connection with the validity of inferences, what I then call the principle of semantic purity. This principle said that if no external information, no axioms, no assumptions, nothing is present, it must be possible to establish the premises of an inference solely by the semantical means characteristic of the premises. This is an adequacy condition for the definition of validity, for the definition of the local validity of inferences. And in the case of the X-false quadruped, this would mean that if no external information, no axioms, no assumptions is present, falsity cannot be established at all. However, in the case of the liar paradox, we have the situation that falsity can indeed be established without any external input, which means that this global adequacy condition is not satisfied. So the principle of semantic purity is not satisfied in the context of the liar. Falsity can be derived by semantical rules alone. And this means that in this situation, the X-false or quadruped can no longer be considered a valid rule in this situation. We revise this local rule of the X-false or quadruped on the basis of global considerations. So the picture is we have rules that we justify at a local level, but there are certain global adequacy conditions that come into play. And in certain areas, these adequacy conditions are met. In other areas, these adequacy conditions are not met. And that way, we can distinguish the validity of certain inferences, because, of course, if the adequacy condition is not met, we would not consider the inference to be a valid inference. The justification of local inference rules always take place in a global context, and in a sense, we can classify the global context by the influences that contexts have on the justification of local inference rules. So the liar paradox shows from this sort of perspective that we are dealing with that we are indeed dealing with a particular global context here. And not that our overall reasoning principles are flawed. This is definitely not the case. And I come there to what I call the consequentialist approach. This is much inspired by ideas of Lars Halnäs. So the general diagnosis is that the global situation itself is not the problem. So non-standard contexts are perfectly legitimate. So constructions like the liar antinomy, the liar paradox, is a perfectly legitimate way of constructing something. They just lead to consequences in which the principle of X-false or quadruped is not applicable. So we just look for the consequences, and we don't say in a pretty foundationist way that what we started with, the context itself, is somehow flawed. So local principles are always justified in certain global contexts. We classify these global contexts by their local consequences that they have. And as I said, in the case of paradoxes, we have a non-standard global context implying restrictions on the use of certain rules of X-false or quadruped, in particular, rules which in normal contexts can be used without restriction. So in the case of the liar paradox, we generate indeed a contradiction, and thus falsity, but since the justification of the X-false or quadruped is problematic in this case, we just stay with the falsity, and the falsity is no longer explosive because we cannot conclude from this falsity anything. This is what is also called paraconsistent logic, a logic that may be inconsistent, but where these inconsistency don't have explosive consequences. The slogan then should be in defense of definitional freedom. So we can do, by means of definitions, all sorts of constructions which may then have certain consequences and which make the situation a non-standard situation, but nevertheless we should have the freedom to perform these things. So in the case of the liar paradox, we define a sentence by its own negation, and this is absolutely fine. As a definition, this is still permitted. this definition has consequences. This is one thing. So but this does not mean that the definition per se should not be allowed. This is something that in computer science, this sort of view, this consequential, this stance is quite more common in computer science than, for example, in philosophy. So there you deal much more with things that are not defined, with things that don't terminate, and so on and so forth. So I think in that respect, there are many things philosophy can learn from computer science, in particular with respect to anti-foundationism. I conclude with some remarks on the future of logic. There are contradicting signals. So a positive signal, for example, is the proclamation of a World Logic Day recently in November of last year, that will be held on the 14th of January of every year, was proclaimed by UNESCO. And UNESCO in the reasoning set proclaimed it, recalling that logic as a discipline that encourages rational and critical thinking is of paramount importance for the development of human knowledge, science, and technology, and further recalling that the dissemination of logic, a discipline that was developed by different civilizations and is based on the virtues of discourse and argumentation, can contribute to the achievement of a culture of peace, dialogue, and mutual understanding among nations. So these are quite strong words, and so that make you think that logic is, formal logic is the greatest endeavor ever, and you can be happy to work on it. On the other hand, sometimes there are certain doubts, and these doubts come from the fact that logic has come under pressure recently. Actually, not only logic, but also the whole of discrete mathematics, at least as far as its dominating position is concerned. And this challenge came from artificial intelligence. In the old days of artificial intelligence, traditionally, logic used to be a predominant part of AI. So if you look at old AI books, textbooks from 30 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago, you have chapters on logic, first order, higher order logic, rule-based reasoning, formalization of reasoning, semantic modeling, and all these things. So this was in artificial intelligence somehow in the center of doing logic. But I mean, this has been put into question nowadays by modern AI and essentially by machine learning, where the statistical models, statistical inference and deep learning challenge discrete mathematics actually as a whole. And sometimes I think perhaps there is a paradigm change taking place behind our backs, in Kuhn's sense, which means that we old logicians are dying out, and a new logicians of mathematicians is growing in computer science that are not doing discrete mathematics and logic as the most fundamental topics, but statistical inference and such things. This would mean that we no longer consider discrete Turing machines with a tape or with discrete numbers on it, a machine that has discrete states and whose discrete states are transformed in other discrete states, but quite a different sort of mathematics underlying computer science. This is actually a very nice banknote that will go into circulation next year in England, and £50 notes about Alan Turing. So these were real experts who created the design of this banknote. So I hope not that, I don't hope that this sort of things will happen. I think that formal verification is much too important and cannot be done on a statistical level. at least not to its full extent. Formal verification of hardware and software is still one of the main applications of logic in computer science. Logic will continue to play its role in safety critical applications that you also don't want to leave to statistical inference. Logic will play its role in semantics, not only in natural language semantics, but also in various sorts of semantics, including the semantics of programming languages and so on. And in the formal sciences, there will always, particularly mathematics, there will always be conclusive reasoning. And the basis of conclusive reasoning is logic, as we saw at the beginning. But I do think that these new methods will enter logic. So we will have machine learning in computer science in relation to logic. We have already the situation that there are automated reasoning systems whose search trees are transgressed in a certain way, and that the way these search trees are transgressed is based on machine learning methods. Logic might change its shape in the future. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen. But if we extrapolate current directions, I would say that logic will become more pluralist. So I would guess that people will, in the long run, more be interested in developing general logical frameworks in which rival logics can be embedded, rather than having these controversies, which logic is the right logic. I think logic will become more type theoretic. There are strong indications that in current mathematics, the type theoretic paradigm is getting more and more ground, partly due to the work, or to a great extent, due to the work of Per Martin Löf, the Stockholm mathematicians who developed a constructive variant of type theory. Per Martin Löf, by the way, is receiving the Rolf Schock Prize this year together with Dirk Pravets, the prize that I mentioned at the beginning. And I also think that logic will become more intentional, not only intentional in the sense of the interpretation of natural language. That has already been intentional, but I guess that it will become more intentional even in other areas where standardly extensional methods have dominated, particularly and including mathematics and also computer science, all the computational paradigms. So I think logic will have a future. I think that science and reasoning will continue to contain logic as a basic ingredient. And that I finish with, this is a quotation from André Gide, who says that the fear of stumbling makes the mind hold tightly onto the handrail of logic. Thank you very much.